In this video, I'm going to explain some of the common ideas in America about grief and pass along commentary from researchers who want to keep these common ideas from pressuring or hurting people more. I'll start this video by describing the pair of concepts about grief that are most common in America these days. Part 1 is grief work and the 5 stages of grief. In the second part of this video, I will quote some of the bigger researchers in grief and explain why they disagree. It's not the 5 stages. Then in the third part of the video, I'll give some examples of other ways that psychologists look at grief. And lastly, I'll talk about what this points to for you, what your path might be. In the quick first video I did on grief, I mentioned that when researchers examined people who recovered from grief, they didn't find any single path or single set of characteristics or attitudes that correlated with recovery. What they found was lots of paths to recovery, and I hope this video explains a bit. Okay, this is part 1, about the common American ideas. The first idea is that there is active grief work to be done, and it requires effort and suffering on your part. And furthermore, if you don't do it, that there might be trouble. This was suggested by Sigmund Freud back in 1917, but like much of what he theorized, it's not universally true. Some people might indeed feel and work through suffering, but you're not doing something wrong if you don't. Freud is famous because he published a lot of framework ideas in psychology, but he didn't back much up with large sample evidence. He just used anecdotal experience from his patients. In the 2000s, we're still building that evidence-backed research, but the results of that real research haven't made it into the folk wisdom in our culture. So what people out in public believe are some out-of-date ideas that don't match the actual evidence. The second common notion about grief is that it has 5 stages, and you'll hear that from many regular people and websites. You've probably heard grief goes through denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. This idea came from another smart thinker, a psychiatrist named Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. In the 1960s, she worked in hospice settings with dying patients, and in 1969, she published the 5-stage theory, which summarized what she had gathered from the patients she had seen. Like Freud, she treated people, thought about what seemed like common threads in their stories, and wrote a theory. Notice too that she didn't write about survivors grieving. Her work was about the dying themselves. Most people in public today don't know that. And citing one's own anecdotal experience, which is part of what I'm doing in these videos, is different from the researchers who are collecting thousands of points of data and running analytics to find actual commonalities in all of them. Okay, now part 2. In fact, research studies over the past 50 years deny the 5 stages. The American Psychological Association publishes a summary of actual research studies on grief, and the top box is a quote of what the main authors and editors of that wrote in a paper in 2017. Note that they say the 5 stages theory should be discarded. There's no scientific foundation, and using it as a guide might be harmful. And the Institute of Medicine published a review of the theory that explained that harm in the second box. If you assume stages that aren't actually correct, you can push or shame people into feeling that they must be doing it wrong. You can pause the video here to read the quotes, and there are details we can get into, but the key point here is, do not cause harm to yourself or others by asserting that there is a need to suffer and work, or that you need to see the 5 stages being acted out. Grief might include some of that, but it doesn't have to in order for the person to process the loss and to go on to live a full and healthy life. Okay, so I feel like now we immediately need a part 3 to give some other ideas to go on. Well, I can't say it's not 5 stages, it's actually XYZ that happens, because there isn't one answer. There are many concepts that may apply or that may be a stronger part of your process or non-existent for you. So one key takeaway is that there's not a single right way for you to do this, and therefore, you probably don't have to worry if you aren't feeling the way that you think you should be feeling. That's not as easy as having one single answer, but let me explain some current concepts, and I hope that will help this make sense. For example, one thing that research is pointing to is that who you are before your loss and the specifics of how your loss happens can be important factors in what you go through in grief. Who you lost and when it happened in life, and whether it was unexpected or expected, can all contribute to how you grieve and what you encounter in the first months. Interestingly, these circumstances don't change the majority positive recovery outcomes, but they might present different things to cope with along the way. But there's also research that points to what psychologists call your attachment style as being important. You can look up more if you want to, but you don't have to. In oversimplified terms, if you are very independent and confident, you're likely to have a different grief experience than someone who depended on constant contact and reassurance from a loved one. But neither is a right way to do things. I think that the above might even sound a little obvious, but again, remember that this is why you don't have to go through denial, anger, bargaining, and so on. Many people recover in a resilient and confident way within the first year, depending on context and other factors, and we'll see that next. The Trajectories model of grief doesn't list exact emotions and phases that you'll go through, but it does talk about general outcomes. The Trajectories view came from analysis of thousands of actual cases. In the immediate aftermath of loss, everyone showed sadness, distress, and yearning for their loved one. But when tested at 6 months, almost 50% of people were free of difficult depression and stayed that way when tested at 18 months and 4 years post-loss. Another 40% had some difficulty but were improving on their own. One researcher suggests that this makes sense because the human race has been suffering loss for thousands of years, yet hasn't generally been stopped by it. There are some people, about 10 to 15%, who have prolonged and difficult grief, and that is not anything wrong. It may just be the circumstances or the fact that they have lots of other stress due to poverty or discrimination or lack of resources. But the research shows that most people recover, and some do it within months, without significant depression and without needing intervention. People take lots of paths to recovery. The researchers guessed at 5 general trajectories. Again, all of these groups felt distress in the immediate aftermath. The nearly 50% who were resilient never had prolonged depression. The acute recovery group did have significant down periods but then recovered. The moderate improving had moderate depression but improved on their own in the first year and at the 18-month test point. The moderate stable had moderate depression and stayed there, and then there were about 10% who had prolonged depression that was becoming more difficult. The Trajectories researchers also talk a bit about what they observe people doing, but I will come back to that in part 4. Before I do that, let me illustrate some other concepts of grief. The dual process model again keeps things general, but says that grieving is oscillating back and forth between loss orientation and restoration orientation. You might sometimes focus on the loss and the feelings, thoughts, and memories around it, and other times, even in the first few days, weeks, and months, you might be in the process of restoring your life, doing very functional things like cleaning the house, managing your job and finances, and enjoying hobbies or entertainment. And then in the middle of it, you might feel the loss again. There's nothing wrong with people who do this. One of the key differences from the old ideas of grief work and the 5 stages is that it's not automatically avoidance or denial to live your life. It's one of 2 processes that are both part of the grief and adaptation to loss. Sometimes restoration might look like you're out in the world and no one would know you had lost someone. But restoration might also be you working just to get out of bed and getting to the grocery store, and that's part of getting back to your life as well. It doesn't mean you're always going to be chipper while you're restoring your life. The last group of concepts around grief identify different places where your distress might be focused. And again, different people will have a different experience depending on their mix. I'm just going to scratch the surface here, but some researchers view the focus of grief as being a change in a relationship where you were attached and derived a sense of safety. Others view the major distress as being located in how you thought the world worked and what you assumed you could rely on in life. Still others think that the distress is around a major disruption in how you connected to your social network. You may have lost a spouse who facilitated your social engagements, and now furthermore might feel isolated because your sadness might not feel socially appropriate, and you have to build new grounding and new bridges. You might have strong social connections and be more restoration-oriented than loss-oriented, and that's fine. Or depending on your circumstances, you might have a lot of broken trust with the world that feels most important to figure out, and spend a lot of time thinking and feeling around that. There's not one path, and those are just some of the concepts of what different people encounter in grief. I've just mentioned some of the research discussions and simplified it because honestly I don't think you need to wade through it, but I wanted to give you a flavor so that you can understand the bottom line. There isn't a specific recipe. I know in the early days it's very common to think, this feels bad and I want to know what I need to do to feel better as soon as possible. I wish there were a one-size-fits-all answer for that. It might be frustrating to hear that there isn't one simple answer like that. But the good news is that it is very likely that you won't feel this bad consistently, and there might be something to do. The Trajectories researchers tried to find the simple answer and the magic set of steps, but didn't. But they did find something. The people who recovered seemed to take a lot of different steps. They had a broad repertoire of coping skills, and they switched between them rather than just staying put and using a few coping mechanisms. I have some videos on a table of coping mechanisms in the thread on coping. It's the same principle as what I discussed there for dealing with traumatic news and stress, even if no one has died. In your situation, do what you want to do now to deal with this, and don't worry that you're screwing yourself up for later. In a day or few, or some weeks, try some other coping strategies from other categories. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to be happy sometimes. It's okay to avoid it some days, and it's okay if you never bargain or get angry or come up with some grand meaning. You don't have to do all of them, and when researchers checked in, even 4 years after the loss, the vast majority of people were doing well. They weren't unhealthy because they didn't do 5 stages. If you want to read more, I did create this table of some of the most active and commonly cited researchers around the world. This is a good start of a reputable list. George Bonanno has 2 very readable books, but you can look up any of these if you want. I hope this has been helpful and that maybe some of the other videos are too.